I'm Mark Graban. I am the author most recently of a new book called The Mistakes That Make Us. It's available now. But today we're going to talk about some things related to my previous book from 4-ish years ago called Measures of Success: React Less, Lead Better, Improve More. Really happy to be joined by a good friend of mine and colleague in this world of continuous improvement, Elisabeth Swan. How are you?
I am good, Mark Graban, and better for having been invited. Always a good time.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about bowling charts and some alternatives that I think are closer, if they're not state of the art. I don't know, these are empty phrases, right? Like world-class management practices, I don't know. I'm going to call it better, and I'm going to try to demonstrate that in a couple of ways here today. And we're going to be able to do some chat and have some interaction. So hello, Hector from Mexico. So if you want to put in the chat where you're coming from, that would be cool to see, and then we'll take your questions. And I'm going to ask your thoughts as we compare these methods for looking at performance measures and data and the decisions that we would make as leaders in the context of Lean or Lean Six Sigma or what have you. But Elisabeth, tell everyone a little bit about yourself, your website, your podcast, your book.
Well, that's a lot, Mark. Okay, so I have, like Mark, decades in the business, over 30 years, and a lot of different industries, and focused actually a lot now in healthcare, like Mark, and have been a coach and a consultant helping companies do some transforming into problem-solving cultures. And my most recent book is Picture Yourself a Leader, Illustrated Micro Lessons for Navigating Change, and just looking at the people-centric side of problem solving and what, the reality that not all of us recognize that we are leaders, but that people are watching us, and that it might be in not in our title, but in the way people see us. And then the website that Mark is mentioning, Just in Time Cafe, that is a free learning nexus where we have regular podcasts and webinars with the idea of a rising tide lifts all boats. Mark Graban has been a guest on both the webinars and the podcast, but just bringing folks in to talk about the things like Mark's book that make a huge difference in problem solving.
Yeah, so I hope people will go check out jitcafe.com, check out Elisabeth's book, Picture Yourself a Leader. We've got people here from England, Ohio, Indiana, Texas. We got a howdy from Houston, which seems totally appropriate way to send greetings. So I'm going to start with the meat of the content here in a minute, but I do want to mention again my book, Measures of Success: React Less, Lead Better, Improve More. As of yesterday, it is once again available on Apple Books for those of you who prefer that ecosystem and format. It's available through Amazon as a paperback, hardcover, and Kindle book. And again, you can now get that. It is no longer an Amazon exclusive. You can get it again on Apple Books. All right, so bowling charts. Elisabeth, are you a bowler? Would you call yourself that? Have you ever bowled?
I have bowled. I would say that makes me a bowler. I would not say I'd put that in any kind of a, resume. But yes.
Did you enjoy it, or like there's beer involved sometimes, so that made it or?
There is a place in New Orleans called Mid-City Rock and Bowl, and there's bands and people are in costumes, and I would say those are some bowling highlights. Absolutely, I enjoyed Mid-City Rock and Bowl.
Wow, that sounds. I grew up in Michigan, and bowling was, and maybe is still, popular. I haven't bowled much as an adult. I bowled in a league with some coworkers like 20 years ago, and I actually dug this out from the closet. I have a bowling ball. Like, look, it's like multicolored, and like I don't know if my thumb even fits. I don't know if I would want to use this today, but I have a bowling ball. I'm happy I didn't drop it on my toe. But I mean, Elisabeth, you probably remember, like when you bowl, maybe you don't want to pay attention to the score, but you keep score. Like it's a game, even if you're not being competitive, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The score, whether you're super competitive or not, once there's something being captured, you're like, you pay some attention.
And I mean, I'm old enough where we used to keep score by hand. You had to actually draw on this thing that was projected like an overhead slide. I mean, again, further dating myself. Nowadays, the bowling alleys do this in a very automated way, usually. And actually, I dug up a picture of a time I went bowling, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago. And I don't mean to brag. I don't know. Like, this is one of the best games I ever bowled. I bowled a 235. For those of you who don't know bowling, the maximum score is a 300, a perfect game if you roll 12 strikes. But like, this is like the format for bowling. And so now we think about bowling charts, and I'm going to share an example of that in a minute. Like in a workplace, for people who didn't know, like, I think that this is the origin and the parallel of seeing like a grid of numbers on a wall. I mean, I'm sure you see this, Elisabeth.
Oh yeah, the affectionate name I use is wall of data.
Wall of data, wall of numbers. And like here, I mean, I went bowling by myself, which maybe that sounds sad. I didn't mean to be antisocial, but I had some free time and I went. Usually, if you're bowling with 4 or 5 people, you would see a wall of data projected up on that screen of people's scores, and you can compare your progress and how you're doing competing with each other. But we could maybe keep score like in context of lean management. I mean, I saw this first time, like, General Motors, 1995, like an hour by hour chart, for tracking production.
Yeah.
And again, like, a list of numbers. I mean, we can look and see, well, the number on the right is lower than the number on the left. There was like no root cause to be found in this case of like, why was there a performance gap? But sometimes people show data this way, which might be helpful, maybe for some kind of real-time problem identification. Or have you seen this in use, Elisabeth?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I see this presented to me many times over the course of coaching somebody. I'm like, okay, yeah. These are good numbers to have.
They're good numbers, but then like, what do we do with it, right? So it's in these numbers, they're visual, but then to make it visual management, like I remember, and this was a problem at General Motors, like they had somebody hired in from a Toyota supplier who taught some of these methods, and GM management with that GM culture at the time used these numbers to know who to yell and scream at. And like, that is not the intent of the Toyota production system, and kind of a cautionary tale of using a quote unquote lean tool in a different type of culture, yelling and blaming instead of constructive problem solving.
Yeah, shame charts.
Shame charts. And then there's all kinds of stories, and I've blogged about this before, where leaders then feel pressured to fudge the numbers, which you could do if you were keeping score at the bowling alley by hand. The electronic scoring makes that a little harder to do. But if we think about different ways of visualizing performance, I mean, this kind of converted the grid of numbers into a chart. Like, maybe this is what an actual bowling chart would look like. The purple line is showing the ideal score frame by frame, and then you can see the yellow line. I started off a little behind ideal, and then I was tracking pretty well, and then I trailed off. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know how this would help me improve my bowling game, but I think it's visual in a different way than the old grid of numbers would be.
Little bit.
So when we're thinking about workplace metrics, corporate metrics, how do we make better decisions based on data? A list of numbers, a grid of numbers, or a chart. Grids of numbers kind of establishing kind of this approach from keeping score in a bowling match. I mean, I've seen a lot of metrics represented like this, like a list of numbers. I mean, it's sort of visual, but I don't know, Elisabeth, quick, what kind of trends do you see there? What's the list of numbers tell you?
I see numbers changing fast, Mark, and none of them are the same. I say no numbers are the same.
Why was December lower than November?
Quick.
I mean, that question gets asked a lot. Why was December lower than January? Do we have a quote unquote trend? Like, people might say those things, but I don't know if that's necessarily true. Sometimes we see, is this more like your wall of data? Is that what you called it?
Yeah, wall of data.
Wall of data. And,
Wall?
no, see, here's kind of an advanced format bowling chart where we see, in this case, like 6 different metrics. We see a comparison between an actual and a target. And then for those who don't want to look and compare the numbers, there's some helpful color coding. We've got greens and we've got reds. How do a lot of workplaces react to the reds, Elisabeth?
Yeah, it's once again, it's a shame chart. So it's no bueno. You don't want the red. And yeah, but this one it's funny because it has like a pseudo visual management, right? Just adding those colors. It's like it forgives the chart for being a wall of data. Whereas you're still
say more about that.
Well,
Forgiving the
you think about visual management. We often are asking people, bring this into a visual. Give me some visual cues to what I'm saying. So the red green, they've said, here's some visual cues, but it's still a wall of data. It's still something you are going to struggle to figure out. What am I looking at? What does it mean? And yeah.
And there's a lot of management traps people fall into when they're using this bowling chart format. They might overreact to the difference between green and red. I mean, like this bottom number here, patient experience scores. It goes from red to green and then red. I mean, like, would we throw a pizza party because it was green and now get upset at people? And maybe the shame and blame and punishment comes out because it's red. But look at the difference between those numbers, 77.6 and 77.2. Like that's not a statistically meaningful difference, but it just happens to be, fluctuating around the red green. And I've seen organizations that will either react to every red, or they might say like, oh, if you have 2 red data points in a row, you have to start in A3. You have to do root cause problem solving. Like there's probably no root cause for why.
No.
It's such small fluctuations, or what you might call common cause variation.
Or it equates things like there's what is it? The patient experience, there's a 78% in red. There's an 80% in green, right? So as you say, there's like a couple of points there. But that all of those are equated. So you can go as low as 40%, still just red, like the 78, which was, 2 marks off 80. So yeah, not helpful.
Some reds are worse than others. Some reds might be more meaningful. And then there's the question of I could only imagine how many hours might have been spent arguing if the goal should have been 77.5 or 78.3. It's just such a precise goal. If everything was green at a 77.5% patient experience hospital rating, we could still improve. And I think that's a different trap of I've heard people say literally oh, well, the metrics are green, so there's nothing to look at. There's nothing to look into.
Yeah. We're hitting our targets. And you're saying, are those good targets? And can we do better?
Should we raise the target? But again, if there's that blame and fear and punishment culture, people don't want the red. They want to set easily achievable goals so they can be green, when our focus, should be on improvement. I think, working toward perfection. And if we're satisfied with hitting the target, that doesn't mean that's not always the best thing for the business or for the health system.
No.
All right, so now I'm going to ask everyone to be much more active through the comments, and if you've got questions or comments, I am seeing those here in the StreamYard window. I'm going to put up 4 different metrics, and then we're going to kind of simulate, let's say we're in a management review meeting where we're being asked to make snap decisions, quick decisions. So I'm going to put up these 4 lines of data. There's some red and green. There's something labeled as trend. We can see the target site 1, site 2, site 3, site 4. I'm going to intentionally not give you a lot of time to mull this over. But here's the question. Which of the 4 sites deserves the most attention right now? We're looking at the December numbers. It's January of the year. Which of the 4 deserves the most attention and why? Please put that in as a comment. And while we're waiting for that, Tamara made a great comment here. We should also understand what we did to be green so we can learn. Right? So instead of, the reds, I totally agree. The reds aren't the only opportunity to learn and improve. If we're actually making progress in a good direction, we want to understand, is that because of something we're doing, or is it just happening? Is it because of outside factors? Trying to understand that cause and effect is really critical.
Have you ever heard the term positive deviance?
Yeah, it's a weird jargony term.
It's a weird jargony term, but and I think there's also sort of comparative problem solving might be a less jargony one, but like you're saying, what's different about Site 3, right? If I look at the processes of one, I'm just building on what Tamara pointed out, and what you're saying, which is what's different about them from the other sites? Like, is there something different in their processing?
Right. And before we even get to that, of trying to understand why, I'm curious again, what's drawing the most attention and why. So Denise said Site 2. That one's all red. Dan says, depends if there's clear rationale for Sites 1 and 2 to have a higher target. Right? So Sites 1 and Site 2 have a target of 90. Sites 3 and 4 have a target of 70. Tamara says Site 4 because of the regular variance. Michael Sharkey says Site 3 has gone down from 80s and 90s in the first quarter to 70s, and their target is low.
Oh, right.
I've done this in workshops, and I've had people make a case for 1 or for 2 or for 3 or for 4. There's rarely consensus. And think, well, then what happens as a management team if we're trying to decide where attention is needed to understand a place where performance has dropped? Do we need to go and understand why? Do we need to start some root cause problem solving? Do we need to go do a site visit? Do we need to understand a site that's performing really well, as a positive outlier, a positive deviant, because they're deviating from standard practice? Mm-hmm. But I think this is where bowling charts to me are not as helpful as the alternative that I'm going to share next, called the process behavior chart. And so another comment, Site 2, there's a consistent downward trend month on month in Site 2, because there are some issues with some months. Issues are reoccurring maybe. So that's a potential trap, though. Right? And I think looking at this list of numbers makes it really hard, if not impossible, to try to separate what Dr. Deming and Don Wheeler, a statistician who's still writing and working today, that would point out, the difference between common cause variation and special cause variation, or you might call that the difference between signal and noise. We have somebody who made a comment, I can't really make sense of this without a run chart. And it's not a dyslexia-friendly display. It might not be a color blindness-friendly display if we can't tell the difference between red and green. And it's funny that that's the color coding that most often gets used, and I think that is a very common form of color blindness. But it's funny that this is called a bowling chart. It's not really a chart. Someone made the comment here about a run chart. I think a run chart is a more helpful visual, and a process behavior chart builds upon a run chart. So let's take a look at that. All right, so first I'm going to put up here in the lower left a process behavior chart, and there's a deeper dive that we could take some other day about how to create the charts and how to calculate what we call the lower and upper limits, and that's in my book, Measures of Success. But so it starts off with a run chart. So that's in orange. And now, to me, that's just so much clearer that January was really, really low, and there's maybe generally this upward trend throughout the year. Like, to me, that's just so much easier to see in a run chart, aka line chart, compared to a list of numbers. Now, maybe that January, that 4 being a single digit, jumps out more than a 27 would have. But to me, there's just so much more advantage to visualizing it this way. Now, the green line here is the average for the year. That's calculated. This red line here and the other red line, we call these the lower and upper limits of the chart. And we'll see some other examples where the context of that might be helpful. But I think, what's interesting about this process behavior chart for Site 1, and before I do the color overlay, I think it's actually going to pull up the chart for Site 2. So Site 1 and Site 2 they jump out to people sometimes because they're all red. But I think there's a clear difference where Site 1 is showing like some significant improvement, where Site 2 is maybe just kind of fluctuating around that average. And we see, for Site 2, because all of those data points are within those calculated lower and upper limits, we would describe all of those data points as being common cause variation. Like, there's no root cause for any of those data points or what's different. Whereas Site 1, like, there's certainly something to be understood about what drove that improvement. Site 2, we might not be happy with the performance because it's always in the red, but we need to improve the system instead of fixating on the most recent data point. There we go. So now if we bring up that red-green overlay, that sort of illustrates, I think, a little bit differently what's seen in the bowling chart. So we have another comment here. There's always room for improvement with all the sites. That's true. But for priority's sake, okay, they gave us a ranking here. Site 2, Site 4, Site 1, and Site 3. But, to me, I think there's a different thought process around improving Site 1. Like, we want to understand what happened over the course of the year, and if performance is sort of settling in around this level, like, how do we make sure we're sustaining that? And then if it stabilizes, we can step back and ask, how do we improve the system in a way that boosts performance upward? Site 2, I think we would have that conversation around saying, well, performance is relatively stable or predictable, but we don't like the level of performance. So I think, I've tried to make this case in the book and different things I've taught of, understanding when we should be reactive and when we should be a little bit more systematic and look at the bigger picture. So I think, to me, there's hopefully a clear difference between Site 1 and Site 2. We see a list of numbers, it's all red. The trend arrow could be misleading. A lot of times this quote-unquote trend, all it's doing is comparing the last 2 data points. So for Site 1, I would say, sure, over the course of 12 months, there's a trend. Site 2, there's not really a trend. There's just fluctuation. So we have, for Site 1, a signal. Both these data points at the end that are really close to the upper limit, this data point at the beginning that's below the lower limit. Like, clearly this is not just fluctuating around an average, where Site 2 is doing that. So we would describe all of those data points as noise. And again, we would improve in a different manner, different style of improvement, less reactive, more systematic. And then we can look at Sites 3 and 4. Here's the process behavior chart for Site 3. Was always green, but Elisabeth, what's your reaction to this chart?
Yeah, so there's special cause, right? You've got the spike in the beginning, and then you've got steadily performing below average based on these limits. But yeah, there's trouble. There's trouble here.
Yeah. And this could be a spike, in these beginning data points, the first 3 data points, or if we actually had the previous year's data. Like, maybe it was fluctuating pretty consistently around an average, and then something happened right about here, March, April, that then caused the performance to shift. So, this is an example where you could actually calculate, probably the most helpful average would be to calculate the average for those 9 data points, because it now seems to be fluctuating, around a new average. So I think, we want to be careful of avoiding the trap of, well, site 3 is all green, and people might say nothing to see here, but they've got a relatively low target. But there's clearly been something that we would want to go investigate. Vivian posts a question here. What's better, improving or staying within the average? So I'd say, well, improving for sure. And we can use process behavior charts to see the difference between continued fluctuation and a statistically meaningful improvement. And I think, it's very visual, and there are a couple of rules that we could use, including, looking for any data point that's above the upper limit or below the lower limit. Seeing 8 or more consecutive data points that are all on the same side of the average. In this case, performance has gotten worse, right? If we were sort of flip this chart, we would say, well, there's evidence of some improvement that has been sustained. And we will make sure that we understand why. Great comment here, and I think this is some important nuance to Vivian's question. It depends on what we're trying to achieve. Sometimes it's stability, and sometimes it's increasing or decreasing an indicator. So that's a good point. And then Sandro says, it depends on the intrinsic randomness of the measurement, or we could call that the level of common cause variation, that the boundaries, which I would call the lower and upper limits, help avoid kind of short-term overreaction. I'm kind of paraphrasing. I think Sandro and I are on the same page, but just slightly different words to describe that same thought process. So the one that's all green is actually hiding an important piece of information we need to understand. And then here's the one that was going between the red and green. Another chart that's just fluctuating around an average. And this happens a lot when an organization sets their target to be something suspiciously close to last year's average. This is just fluctuating, and it'll continue to do so. And I think there's a lesson here about not overreacting to, let's say, this November data point that was red. The same system that's generating this red data point also generated the green data points. I don't think it would be a good use of time to try to do a root cause analysis about why November's number was 67, because the process behavior chart shows us it's just part of the noise.
Yeah. And if you want better performance, then you're going to have to look at the whole process. You can't
be less reactive, more systematic.
Yeah.
And so comparing the evaluation of those two charts, site 3, there's a clear signal. Something happened. Can we figure out what happened 9 months ago? Maybe we do. Maybe we can. Maybe we don't know. Site 4 shows noise. So again, like for all of these, even site 3 that was always in the green, there is a lesson in this case to be learned from the chart. There is certainly room for improvement, as there is for all 4 of these sites. So back, I don't know, to answer my own question, if I was looking at the process behavior charts, which do I think requires the most attention? I would say, well, maybe site 3, because there's been this downward shift in performance that seems to be pretty well sustained. Let's make sure we understand what happened. Is there something that happened that we can counteract? Or is it, too late? Was the signal, the shift in performance caused by something, market factors? Did we get a new competitor? And now this metric has dropped, and now we've got to figure out other ways to improve our system other than just undoing something that happened back in this March, April timeframe. And then, I think, again, back to site 1, if I can get it to go back here, we would want to understand how and why things got better over the course of the year. And it's a different thought process. Instead of browbeating somebody for being red, we could celebrate the improvement and make sure we understand why the improvement was there, why it happened.
Yeah. Give them a pizza party.
Right. Yeah, red-green is not the only criteria that matters. And I think sometimes bowling charts, again, create a lot of those traps.
They drive a different emphasis, not helpful.
And it can be unhelpful. It can be counterproductive. So we've got a little time here, and the deeper dive resource, of course, my book, Measures of Success: React Less, Lead Better, Improve More. It's available Now, not just through Amazon in Kindle, paperback, and hardcover format. It's also available now through Apple Books as an Apple Book ebook. So we'll see if there are any other comments. Elisabeth, let me turn it to you. Do you have any other reactions or tips or thoughts of the audience around this?
Yeah, I mean, I one thing that strikes me, because like I said, I get, bowling charts thrown at me all the time. And, I'm dealing with people that are new to problem solving. And you probably know the expression, meet people where they are. Mm-hmm. And so I want to get them closer, right? So I try to, start out with a baby step, like a run chart, a line chart, something in Excel. Like if you have one of those charts you showed, all the dates, mm-hmm. and all the numbers on those dates. Maybe it's weeks, maybe it's months. Hey, that's so easy to grab that and throw that into a line chart. Mm-hmm. And just the idea of having a visual that tells you a story. And I feel like process capability charts tell you a story. So I start out with the baby step, which is, hey, look at this line chart. Is that telling you a story? Yeah, that's how things were. Here's where we started. Then I made some changes. I'll say, when you do your changes, we should see a shift, right? We should see your chart go up or down based on what you did. So, that's part of your story. And I think that resonates for folks. And then I sort of pull them a little bit in, getting closer to, hey, next step would be create a process capability chart.
Yeah. Yeah, and we can do baby steps approach. This is a made up number, but something like 85% of the benefit of a process behavior chart is just visualizing it as a line chart, aka run chart.
Yeah.
People then maybe are sometimes guessing about the difference between signal and noise, but I mean I think as humans it's easier to absorb quickly and take in I think better takeaways from a chart than a list of numbers. I think we're just not built that way.
Yeah. And people also get very tied to averages, which can be, again, massively misleading. So just being able to see, like you said, just visualize over time, how does this play out? It shows you where, hey, if you just averaged all this together, you took away all of that variation. And I think, like you're pointing out, this just gives you this lovely image of the variation. Helpful, ways to understand the process.
We got a comment question here from Michael. And first off, I was going to mention, if you want to learn more about the book, you can go to measuresofsuccessbook.com. You can download a free preview. I put that link in the comments. So Michael commented and then said, this is really great, but how do you convince people who have lived in organizations that have done red-green for their entire career that this is a better method? That is a great question. And it's I'll add there's a wrinkle. It's not even for their entire careers part. Like I've gone into organizations that had maybe just recently, like in the last 2 years, adopted bowling charts with red-green color coding and these rules of thumb that I think are not helpful of like if there's 2 reds in a row, do a root cause analysis. And they'll say, oh, but my lean consultants taught me how to do that. And we just rolled this out. And they don't want to or can't admit that there could be a better way. Like people get really anchored on the way we've always been doing it, even if always is relatively new. But, back to the question, Michael, I think, doing what Elisabeth described of let's convert the bowling chart, or at least a couple lines of it, to a run chart. Do we see something differently? Like sometimes people can convince themselves. We can maybe then take the step of like, let's make it a process behavior chart. What does that teach us? You can try to bring people along like that, but there's a great story I always fall back on. A woman who took my workshop in about 2017 or so, 2018. She went back to her health system and she tried talking about process behavior charts, and she was like, yeah, no one was interested. And she was like, well, so then what she did? She actually just started making some, putting them up even on metrics boards or showing the leaders, like letting them see that visual comparison, sort of like I tried to do here today.
Yeah.
Of like which helps us see more. sometimes, you just sort of try to demonstrate. And I think I appreciate her lesson of like, just, take initiative, make the charts. You're not going to get in trouble. Even if someone says like, oh, no, I'm fine with the grid of numbers. Like, you're probably not going to get in trouble for trying to show the difference.
Another great tactic I've seen in a couple different venues, and I'll give you a story for one of them. I did a lot of continuous improvement in school systems. And two of the metrics they want to improve are test scores and attendance. And there's a story, I was doing this with a colleague, and this was I'm going to go with third grade class. Mm-hmm. And two young boys in the class missed the bus. And instead of going home and getting parents or trying to figure out how to get to school or giving up, whatever, ran all the way to school in Texas. So not entirely safe. We're pulled into the principal's office. Why? What got into your brains to run all the way to school and not go find an adult? And they said, we don't want to be the reason the chart goes down.
Oh.
And apparently every day they took attendance scores, right? So one of the kids would go up and dot on the graph, so doing it live. And then they also had a separate one for when they had a quiz. And that day was going to be a quiz. So both attendance and the quiz were going to be impacted by their absence. And they were determined. They were driven, right, by seeing those visuals. So I think, and I've seen in the hospital groups I'm working with, like daily huddle boards, having a chart, same thing. You get to go and put the next dot on the chart.
Yeah. There could be fear of punishment, or there could be fear of losing a reward. Like, I think, there's times when organizations will offer people prizes for perfect attendance. Like, if you have perfect attendance, you'll be entered to win even a car. Like, even before a pandemic, like even just think about flu season. Like, if someone's sick, they should stay home. And hopefully their employer is giving them sick leave, and do the math of like, I can pay to stay home, or I can pay to come in and get other people sick.
Yeah, I just realized part of the lesson there was that they feared being the ones the reason the chart went down. But I think the other point, and that certainly this works well on the huddle boards in the hospitals for the different tiered performance boards, was that interaction, being part of creating that line chart together, seeing the trend that you're creating together and interacting. And so I was thinking that might help convince people, right? If you're part of it, if you have a role in creating that line chart and it's live, I think that's also something visceral that people engage with.
Such a good story. Good point. There's a comment here from Carlos, or a question. Very good way to see the indicators to identify opportunities for improvement. In the run charts, I saw the control limits of the process. And I'm going to interject and say again, like, those are calculated based on the data. The control limits are driven by the design and the performance of the system. We do not choose the lower and upper control limit. Like, we can choose what a target is, and we should be careful with that sometimes. Yeah. But so here's the question. Should we also add the specification limits or objectives to have a vision of the internal, external, and I think you're right to put that in quotes, customer? Because sometimes a goal is not the voice of the customer, it's the voice of management who said we should set a certain goal. Doing this red-green overlay is, like, to me, that's a way of showing a target or a specification, if you will. Like, different types of control charts that are used for, let's say, manufacturing, process control, the size of a hole that's being drilled in a piece of metal. You would probably have, two-sided specification limits, kind of an upper limit and a lower limit of what's in spec.
Yeah.
But as we've learned through modern quality practices, the goal is not just to have every part in spec, but we want the process to be in control and to be capable to a point where the calculated control limits are actually far narrower than the specification limits. Does that check? Did I say that right, Elisabeth? I haven't thought about the manufacturing specifications piece
Well, I
in a while.
think, yeah, and I think the reality is most of us deal with a one-sided spec, right? We don't go any higher than, don't go any lower than. And so you're reminding me, hey, yeah, there's 2x4s, you know, no less, no more. Although they aren't 2x4 anymore, are they? But what I really like, and I'm taking away from this experience today, is using the vestige of the bowling chart, right? The red green as an overlay so as not to add yet another line to a process behavior chart. And I really like that. It's just a nice, clear, it's telling a good story, right? A clear story, like that clarifies it for me. So I like that.
And hopefully an accurate story, because there's, you know, Don Wheeler calls a process behavior chart, you know, that it's illustrating the voice of the process. You'd say the voice of the system.
Yeah.
Because there's just, you know, things that people do, looking at this list of numbers, drawing a linear trend line. There's all things that you can do to massage or torture the data until it tells the story you want to tell. And I think if that's inaccurate, that doesn't really do us any favors. It might keep you out of trouble in the short term, but it's really going to stifle real improvement.
Yeah. It buries the trouble and stifles improvement.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, I think we'll go ahead and wrap that up. I'm done showing weird or scary AI corporate bowling photos. But, you know, hopefully the more important point of the difference between you know, grid of numbers versus a line chart or better yet, a process behavior chart. I hope that's opened some eyes or reinforced some things that people have learned before and hopefully get to put into practice. So again, I would love to help you with that. You can send me a message through LinkedIn or mark@markgraban.com via email if you want to learn more about this methodology, the workshop, or other ways that I could help. And then before we go, Elisabeth, remind everyone where they can find you online.
You can find me on at the Just in Time Cafe, JITKACAFE.com, or at Elisabeth Swan on LinkedIn, and my name is with an S, right? If you do Elisabeth Swan with a Z, you'll get a million pictures of Keira Knightley from Pirates of the Caribbean, so don't do that.
Good tip. All right, Elisabeth, thank you for co-hosting and being part of this here today. Really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thanks
pleasure, everyone,
Mark.
for attending.
Total pleasure.
Cool.